Alright everybody, welcome to another week of Game Wisdom Live. This is going to be for the week of March 18th, 2018. As you probably know, Rob is not up in my little corner today. Unfortunately, he's busy for the next 2 weeks, which means I'm going to try to find someone for next week's show and see if we can get someone in the corner. But, as always with these shows, it's time to talk about what's been going on the past week in terms of the game industry, as well as what I've been doing on Game Wisdom. So, first off, finally got some little bit of good news. I heard back from another library system locally about doing more presentations, and we're going to be hopefully setting something up as a test run in the fall. And ideally, if that goes well, I'll be able to do presentations with them around the same time I do one with the other system around here. And I'm in talks with a third one. But unfortunately, the library system works, I believe, in terms of their presentations in the fall and spring. And they don't normally do stuff in the summer or winter, at least the stuff that I'm planning. So it's going to still leave some months dead in terms of trying to earn money around here. In terms of some other good news this week, we got a whole lot more subscribers. We are now pushing over 2,900 and on our way to 3,000. So thank you everybody for subscribing. I hope you're enjoying the content here. Also, I did some changes to the thumbnail art as well for the videos going forward. So I'm curious what people think about them in terms of opening them up. Hey Getter, thanks for coming on. Now, one big announcement I was thinking about the other night I want to get everybody's feedback on is regarding the Discord channel and whether or not to open up at least like a basic tier for everybody and then have the additional features and like VIP sections for people who support the Patreon. So, for those of you watching this either live or recorded, please let me know what you think about that, because I'm trying to get as much feedback as I can to maybe make a decision by the middle of this week coming up. But I know we've been keeping it private as a Patreon incentive for the last few months, and, well, it hasn't been doing too much there. Hey, El Gordo. My voice seems to be going in and out. I got a few drinks here. But let me know what you guys think regarding that point. Now, in terms of Let's Plays, of course, we've been doing the Dark Souls 2 play to try and finish the whole set. And hopefully tonight around 10 I'll be able to make some pretty big progress. I think at this point I am about halfway done the main game. We found one of the locations for the DLC, but we don't know how to access it just yet. Let's see. Games I've been playing so far. Just before I started the stream, I've been trying to get through that Super Daryl Deluxe, and it's so close to being a game that I really like. But it's just got some very quirky design decisions to it that make it hard for me to fully fall in love with. I put in press key request for I think it was a game called Darkwood. There it is. Let's see. I got a game called Heavy Metal Heroes, or I think Double Kick Heroes. There it is. It's a rhythm-based zombie killer where you're having to press the buttons in time to the heavy metal music that's playing. It's going in early access at the start of April. Well, unfortunately, I can't show it until then because I am under embargo. I also got a press key for a game called Triplicity, which is supposed to be 1 part puzzle, 1 part CCG game. I played a little bit of it earlier, but I haven't had a chance to sit down and make a video for it. But while it's certainly not going to hit the same levels as Gwent and Hearthstone, it looks pretty charming, at least from what I've played so far. And I think Super Daryl Deluxe is the Dark Souls of Napoleon Dynamite inspired games. Now let's see, we turn to some other things that's been going on. Oh, I finally finished the first draft of my ebook. And I'm not sure where to go from there. I've asked a few people to take a look at it, but if anyone has any suggestions for, I guess, how to go forward, please let me know. Let's see what we got here. Trying to see if there's anything new going on in terms of industry topics. Of course, one of the big ones that happened this past week that broke is that Star Wars Battlefront 2 has decided to upend their monetization system. And let me see if I can pull this up really quickly, because this was a big deal that I think was mentioned on Jim Sterling's show. Oh, let's see. Here, so they are no longer going to be selling loot boxes. Instead, you will earn experience points through play, which will then unlock the star cards, classes, and stuff like that. If you earn enough experience points to gain a level, you'll receive 1 skill point that will be used to unlock or upgrade. So it sounds like they're trying to lengthen the progression curve of the game, which I don't think that's going to... It seems like it's the lesser of the evils. And let's see. Addition to and then, of course, anything cosmetic is going to be in the loot box system from before. So it's basically just trading a big evil for a minor evil, as Oscar said in chat. And it's better, I suppose, but still, it doesn't seem like it's really going to make the game all that much better in terms of spending money. Because people are, of course, going to spend it on the microtransactions. But, again, it's just very hard to tell just exactly how much this is really helping or hurting the game, considering it's been the old way for the last few months. And there's definitely a good point about what people are willing to give in terms of these microtransactions. Yeah, that's the other thing. If the game is not strong right out of the gates, it's pretty much going to die unless they do a major second relaunch. I've been trying to get my friend Jamie Madigan, who looks at the psychology of games, on for a cast. And then I want to talk to him about that, in terms of just how much are people willing to put up with these issues, and whether or not these plans actually work or not. Now, another thing I forgot to mention in the last part, but I've been trying to take questions for kind of like a live game design Q&A session, or even just a record one. So if anyone has questions, there is a video I put up a few days ago that I've been linking to in the past regarding basically anything you always want to know about game design, whether it's a game you're working on, design issues, stuff like that. I'll put a link to it in the chat below as well while I'm trying to talk and do everything. But I figure after how much people came out for that Tim Ruswick discussion, we had a lot of good questions. I thought we could maybe try and do something more regularly on it. Yep, and we've talked about that before with the arms race that developers try to make when it comes to selling power in these games. But here's the link to the Q&A. I'll put in the chat for people watching. Oh yeah, that's a good point there too. I'll do that. I think I'll make that a pin one for now. But as I was saying, when it comes to that momentum of trying to keep people paying and playing, again, it's just an endless power curve. We talked about this with Ramin a few months ago. But you see this in just about any free-to-play or monetized title, whether it's that South Park Phone Destroyer, Battlefront 2, Clash Royale, and so on. That as long as you're willing to keep adding in more units, it's just going to keep creating a power curve. And it's one you can just keep monetizing. So while the system of Battlefront 2 sounds better, again, people are already paying attention to what's happened already. And I'm just wondering, are they going to try and, sneak those bonuses in? A monetized option to get double experience, or buy additional skill points, or stuff like that. But again, it's just not a game that I was interested in to begin with. Now, of course, PUBG and Fortnite are still doing good in terms of their monetization. Though I don't know what Fortnite's doing. I have not heard anything along those lines. PUBG, of course, got into trouble. Oh, I'm sorry, never mind. I did hear Fortnite does have the loot boxes. So I know people did complain about that a few days ago. I think even a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And that's the other point. People are, I think, more willing to accept microtransactions if the game is free. Although I just don't pay them or play them at this point. But when you're spending $60 on top, again, there comes a point, we've said this before, that if your game is not making enough money by retail purchases to keep going, what are you doing with that game? And that's one of the things that's going to be very curious, because for those of you who don't know, there's a GDC talk or one of the presentations about how to handle loot boxes or how to keep regulation from coming in. And again, it just raises that very big question. If you're selling your game at $60 retail, you have a full ad campaign going on, and you're still not making enough money to keep the studio going or keep the game alive, what was the point of making that game in the first place? Yep, and that's another really good point there, Getter. The beauty and nightmare of games as a service is that your game is malleable. We talked about this before with Payday 2 and how the game has made massive changes over its, I think it's like 4 or 5 years now. The same could be said of Team Fortress 2, going from a retail game to free to play, then in-game monetization, then the new modes, and so on. But the point is, if you change your game in a way that people don't like it, what are you supposed to do then? How are you supposed to pivot that game in a direction? And we talked about it before with Team Fortress 2 and how it's changed so much. Yep, and it's just one of those things, like, it's very easy to pivot in a direction, but how do you pivot back without basically acknowledging that you failed? And Payday 2 suffered some major PR issues when they had to go back on the microtransaction model for their loot box system. But it's just one of those cases where you have to be really careful when you make these decisions, because once you do it, it can easily ruin a game. Now, I'm curious, like, for those of you who've played World of Warcraft, how have they done with the changes? Because again, I know the game has certainly transformed from what it was at in 2004 to 2018. And it still is going remarkably strong. It's not as, I think it has lost some subscribers over the years, but again, they're still pulling in, 8 to 9 million subscribers a month. They're not exactly hurting for money. But again, you have to be careful in trying to keep your game alive like that. And I'm almost wrapping up my presentation about Ready Player One and VR and MMOs. And I had a section about the MMO industry and how it all tried to pivot towards World of Warcraft and then pivot towards free-to-play. And while free-to-play has certainly helped out, it hasn't been the miracle worker for a lot of these games. I guess here's a question for you folks watching. Have you played any MMOs that aren't part of the big ones? Guild Wars 2, Final Fantasy, and World of Warcraft. I know Star Trek Online is still going strong, and just like a lot of the bigger games, or just like a lot of the pivots we've been talking about, they've been trying to... they're owned by Arc Games now, is that right? Oh, I guess because Cryptic Studios isn't doing it anymore. But the thing with Star Trek Online is that they've gone, of course, from being a retail one to now being free to play. They now have an in-game store. And of course, I think they have loot boxes. And of course, they sell all these ships that I'm looking at now as well. So, I mean, there's just a lot. And that's the point. Oh my goodness. Their full pack is $129. But the point is, it's just very hard to try and sell people this stuff, especially when it's just a never-ending cycle. And again, we talked about this, I think, on a previous discussion, but one of the smart things Sony did with their PlayStation, what was it, Sony Station service, was you subscribe and you get everything for every game they have. And I think that's going to be a very interesting strategy going forward, is that I don't feel one game is going to be worth it enough to spend money on. But imagine if you bought a Activision pack where you get all the Call of Duties and their DLC. Well, if you could buy a Battlefield pack. But again, that would require a major translation in terms of design and how you sell these games. Because as we've seen, most of the AAA games go for annual releases. Your Battlefields, Call of Duties, and probably Battlefront, etc. But the free-to-play market, it usually keeps to one game, and then that game is just endlessly supported. And it's just going to be a very different thing. And we've said this before, but we're going to probably see a AAA studio attempt a free-to-play game at some point. I mean, a full free-to-play game, not a $60 retail. And what's going to happen from there, I think, is going to be a major point for the studio. Or for the industry, I should say. Yep. And I talked about that with Ramin Jokusaw a few months ago, that the late 90s, early thousands was really like the golden age of MMOs, with everybody trying to do their own thing. But then following World of Warcraft, everyone tried to be the next WoW. And again, that's actually a really good point about the industry. When we see the AAA market, everybody is trying to compete to be, the #1 sports game or the #1 first-person shooter. And then that's the game everybody plays. But you can't do that with an ongoing experience like an MMO. Because people expect when you buy an MMO, that's it for months, if not years. They don't want to see you make World of Warcraft, and then World of Warcraft 2, and then World of Warcraft 3. And that's one of the major points. And exactly, Oscar, regarding Battle Royale. We're going to see who knows how many Battle Royale games between now and the end of 2018. And they're going to be trying to copy it. And they're going to try to be the next Fortnite or the next PUBG. And it's just very strange how Fortnite took off. But even Destiny hasn't been doing all that well. And I know you were mentioning this on the Discord channel, that they're planning on doing a Destiny 3. But again, that's not how you're supposed to support an MMO or an ongoing game. I mean, Payday 2 lasted 5 years, and we still haven't heard news about a Payday 3 yet. I mean, they could have done that at any point in the last 5 years and say, you know what, Payday 2 is done, let's move on to the next one. But you gotta be careful with how you're pitching these games. And it raises here's a very interesting question for you folks. The next PUBG or Battle Royale inspired game, do you think they're going to copy PUBG? Or do you think they're going to try and copy Fortnite? And again, it sounds like a very easy question to answer. But again, Fortnite was very smart. Epic knew that they couldn't just make PUBG but with cartoon graphics and call it a day. That whole building customization, or I'm sorry, the crafting system, it doesn't sound all that amazing from the outside, but you have to remember, all it takes is one defining system to set your game apart, and now you're doing something different. Yep. MMOs don't go for sequels, they go for that annualization. But even that doesn't really work. Because again, this also goes back to what we've been saying before. There's a lot of investment. And it's kind of like that Catch-22. The whole point of getting you to play a free-to-play game or a monetized game is to get you invested in it. Be it socially, gameplay, or monetize. Again, once you spent that money, you now have weight to that game. It's no longer, I don't want to play this game anymore, let me uninstall it. It's now, I don't want to play this game, but I spent $30, $40 already. I'm already in it, let me keep going and see if things improved. Yeah. That does not sound like a smart 10-year plan to me. But getting back to the point, the idea is if you cannot do annual releases and games as a service. Because if I am fully invested in this one game and I've spent, $100+ on it, telling me that you're going to put out a new game and all my purchases don't matter anymore, that's going to piss off people. Exactly, Gator. That sunk cost is a very big point. And again, it goes both ways for developers. We've said this before with knowing when to end a game. But how do you know when that game is done or not? You can just keep adding content and keep adding it, and hoping that you'll hit that magic point where it solves it. And one second, I'm hearing some noise in my ear. Let me close my door. There we go. But the point is, you can't just keep throwing money and design into a title and expect it to magically work, or expect that redemption play. Because it's very hard to do right, and you cannot assume that people are going to support that. We mentioned this before with Skyshine's Bedlam and Brigador Up Armored Edition, and how this was developers trying to make right and basically do a second release. And while it has worked for them, those were independent games, not a $60, how many millions of dollars put into a AAA game. And again, it's just very hard. And sometimes it's just better to move on to the next project. Yeah. That's interesting, Oscar. I mean, I know you play Warframe, and Warframe has been going strong. Again, that's a really good example of just how that allure of that games as a service model. And that's that goal that developers have been chasing. Release one game, endlessly support it, and people keep spending money on it. It's the beauty dream there. But again, that model is not something that you just throw on a marketing point and it works. You have to have both a game that is, great out of the box. You need to have a solid idea of how you're going to support it. And more importantly, you need people to show up and play your game. Because, we saw this with The Secret World, and how they had a very interesting hook. They had a strong campaign or story that they wanted to tell, but it just wasn't getting enough people through the door to play. Or as another point, DC Universe Online, it had a great hook, it had players, but it didn't have the ongoing content to keep people wanting to play it, so it stopped. And that's a really good point there, Garrett, too, about meal has a natural and a menu doesn't. I said this before on that post I made last week. If you're making a car or a movie or a TV show, there is a literal end. When the script has completely finished, you're done. When you've finished editing the movie, that's it. But with a video game, there is no defined endpoint. You can always add another system. You can always do more work on it. Warframe took and that's another point. Warframe didn't just magically show up one day making all that success. It took a lot of time. And I'm curious, Oscar, did you play Warframe from the start, or did you get into it a few years later? Yep. And and that's another really good point there, again. That's something I've learned by writing. Just because you have a lot of words doesn't make your article or that more profound. I used to write routinely, 1,200 to 1,500 word pieces. Now I'm lucky if I break 1,000, and most I saw has been between 600 to 800 words. So, from your point of view, Oscar, you've seen Warframe evolve from start to end, and I'm sure they had rough patches like any other developer. But the point is, they stuck with it. It wasn't just, the numbers starting to dip or we had trouble, let's go move on to Warframe 2. And that's another major point about this sustainability. The ones that succeed, they build a foundation to keep going. Same thing with Warframe, Team Fortress, and even World of Warcraft, despite having those retail purchases. But Team Fortress has that timelessness to it at this point. Same goes for Warframe. The engine, I guess here's a question for you, Oscar. In terms of graphical polish, has Warframe changed since the beta? Because the game definitely has that striking look to it. And that kind of thing goes a long way. It's not like they need to completely create a brand new engine every few years for the game. But trying to keep this going, it takes a lot of work to it, and it's not something that always succeeds. Let me see. Actually, I'm going to quickly look up DC Universe Online for a second. How are they doing? Oh, they're having a St. Patrick's Day event. Let's see. So they are up to episode 30 of their story stuff. Some of it's $4, some of it's... So it looks like some of their episodes are story, some of them are just like PvP and stuff like that. And they have their big thing. Let me see here. How much does that... Okay, so their big, you get everything is a subscription. I mean, again, I don't know how much that's worth it or not. Okay, so they have updated the engine for Warframe. So they are making those adjustments to keep the game competitive. But of course, I doubt we're going to hear them announce a Warframe 2. Same goes for a Team Fortress 3. And again, if you're thinking well enough in the future that you can keep supporting this engine and improve it, go for it. Same thing we're seeing with League of Legends. Again, the big successful free-to-play or ongoing games, they don't need annual games to, raise that interest. And it's probably a nightmare to say, how are we going to, outdo Team Fortress or outdo League of Legends with a sequel? It's just a lose-lose proposition. But that's the thing, like the MMOs that have managed to survive had to make these pivots. But they don't automatically mean your game is going to succeed. Again, we saw this with the MMO crash of the early thousands, with everyone trying to go free to play, and only a few of them have survived. I'm actually interested. I know Lord of the Rings Online was like one of the first. And how are they doing? Alright, so they have their VIP system. Going, additional slots. So, some of these older ones have tried to keep the subscription, but make it like a, we're going to give you all this bonus stuff. Again, remove any frustrating or pain points to the game. I don't know. Again, it doesn't sound like that model is really all that effective these days. When we have Warframe and a lot of the League of Legends, CSGO, and so on, providing this kind of service for free, it just makes it a very hard sell unless your game is World of Warcraft. And maybe Lord of the Rings Online is big enough to kind of stand not exactly toe-to-toe with WoW, but in a relative same circle. But from the original topic, it just raises that point that the AAA market is trying to fit a square peg in a round hole with wanting annualized games, but they also want to keep these games ongoing as games as a service. Now, something like The Division, which we talked about last week, going from The Division to The Division 2, that's going to be a very interesting point. Are they going to have carryover or crossover from the first game? And how are they going to avoid making the mistakes that they did with the first one? Now, of course, the obvious answer is just don't do what they did with The Division 1. But this is the other big point about these annualized or sequels. Do you just take everything that worked with the first one, throw on a new graphical engine and call it a day? Do you try to iterate and go higher with a sequel and maybe try and strike gold a different way. It's just very hard to tell. Yep. The whole Founders Pack thing was just a very hard sell for a lot of people. Like, how are you, like, again, it just feels weird as a first person, someone who started supporting this, to now go that everything is free. We saw that problem with Evolve, and when they try to go free to play and do, again, that massive pivot. Yep. You just cannot keep pivoting like this without pissing off your people. And now, again, it's just very hard to prescribe to that when you have free-to-play market. And we talk about that with the rush to the bottom, or chase to $1 kind of system, where I don't want to spend $14, $15 a month. Why should I when I can play your game for free and then maybe spend, a little purchase here, a little purchase there, and go that way? But we saw a few people try to do MMOs in the last few years, and it just didn't work. And what's very interesting is that the games that have been trying to do games as a service lately, it's kind of a mock MMO, because you're still having a monthly service if you're playing, if you're on, like, Xbox Live or the Sony PlayStation Plus service. And again, I think that could be a very interesting point, that if you make the games free, but you could have access to all of them if you have the PlayStation Plus service or Xbox Live. But again, then you're throwing money out the window. And it's just very hard to know, at what point, how much should I give the consumer? Again, for the consumers watching this, you're probably going, just give us everything and let us support. But in the day, you can't bank a business just on crowdfunding or donations. And that's another really good point, Getter. This is not a really good economy, and we could probably, if we segue into politics, we'll be here all day. But people don't have as much disposable income these days, and with discussions about gambling and problems like that, at some point, someone's got to give. And it goes back to that question we asked a few minutes ago. If tomorrow Congress announces that loot boxes are forever banned from video games, are these games going to survive? And if they didn't, were they really worth playing to begin with? Oh, let it die. Maybe after Dark Souls 2, I can punish myself more by playing that game. But, like I say, like when you hear developers, like I see this with posts on Gamasutra, developers going tooth and nail to defend loot boxes. And the question goes, was your game going to be successful without them? And if it wasn't, was it really worth it to play your game to begin with? And that's kind of the issue here. That these developers, and again, we've said this before, with developers and publishers trying to get as much money out of people as possible. There was that discussion a few years ago about trying to raise the MSRP from $60 to maybe $70 or $80, and people weren't going to have it. But again, the money has to come from somewhere. And if people aren't supporting your loot boxes, or if loot boxes aren't the answer, then you gotta figure out some way to make money. We talked about that before with the Hellblade Setsuna model, or Sensuna. That it was basically a AAA game, or maybe a AA game, released at a budget price, and it did really well. But again, they knew how to cut the costs and budget that game. But when you have a AAA studio, they're having a team of dozens, if not hundreds. You have a marketing campaign, who knows, in the millions of dollars. How are you supposed to make that money? And again, we've said this before, but not every game is going to be a $5 to $10 million copies, or 5 to 10 million copies sold extravaganza. Atlas is probably the king of this. They know to budget their games well. They're not going to be doing, $3 million marketing campaigns. So a modest success for another company is a breakout hit for them. I'm sure with Sega, they are budgeting things really well with the Yakuza series. They know Yakuza is not going to be the next Final Fantasy or Madden. But it works for them. It's making them enough money that it is a success. So they're going to do another Kiwami. And I'm sure we're going to see a Yakuza Kiwami 3, 4, 5, and probably 6 down the line. And again, it just is a matter of knowing how to budget these games. And we said this before, but not every game needs an in-game store. Not everyone needs 3 years of season pass content and additional DLC. Sometimes a game is just a game and we call it. But it's hard to pitch that. I mean, Nintendo, for instance, there's DLC for Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I'm curious if we're going to see DLC for Mario Odyssey. And we already know there is story-based DLC coming for, Splatoon. So people are seeing that it works, and that's the scary point. When you see Breath of the Wild, a massive Game of the Year success, having story-based DLC, that tells you, well, I'm going to release my game and let's pitch, 2 to 3 story chapters. If you see a multiplayer game getting additional maps and weapons, why not do that? It goes back to what Getter was saying earlier, with people kind of chasing their tail around. If Battle Royale sells really well, if you see a top streamer and Drake playing Fortnite and it got, it blew up the internet that night, well, I'm sure we're going to try and see lightning strike twice, a third time, or even 5 or 6 times throughout 2018. But as we've said before, you can't let it strike. You can't guarantee that just because everybody fell in love with Fortnite, they're going to love your Fortnite game, or your PUBG game, or your World of Warcraft. And it just is a case where people are betting studios and millions of dollars on trying to capture a market similar to someone else. And it doesn't work. And we were talking about this last week with the Amiibos and the Labos? I don't even know how to pronounce it. But they're trying to find ways of getting more value. And I would bet you money that if the Amiibos took off, if Toys to Life, that's the mark, I keep forgetting the name, if it was still going, I bet you we would have seen something from Sony and Microsoft by now. But they were kind of smart in this case and not to immediately chase them like they did with motion controls with the Nintendo Wii there. But there's only so much you can really get out of some of these concepts. And it makes it very hard to price your games accordingly. I mean, from the independent space, we're seeing developers struggle with, do I make my game $10? Do I make it $5? Do I even go $20 to $30? And it's just a very hard sell. A few days ago, we did a first look at the game Past Cure, which the game is selling for $30. And people are just not having any of the issues that they have with it. And that's a big point. You mentioned a few minutes ago that Hellblade Sensuna was trying to make a game, or Sensua's Sacrifice, at a AA price. But if an independent developer is trying to get to that level, then people are expecting a pretty complete package. If I'm spending $30, I don't want to see graphical issues, I don't want to see control problems, I want to see a very well put together game. People are more forgiving of technical problems or needing patches after launch if the game's, $5, $10. But not when it's $30. And I want to see something here. The console, that was the other game I looked at this week, they're going for $30 as well. And that game was a lot more technically stable compared to what we saw with Past Cure. but getting that price right is going to work. Let me see. I'm actually curious. There's not a price announced for Super Daryl Deluxe yet, but I'm wondering if they're going to price it like at $20, $30. I can't see it going any higher. And it goes back to what we were talking about, that idea of trying to put a price tag on your game. It's impossible. People will say, content is king, but, if I'm going to spend like $10 on your game, how much content should I reasonably expect? If I expect $60, should I expect 60 hours of play there? You just really can't do it. And it's just hard to sometimes know where to put your money. And that seems to be the theme for today's cast. How do you know when to stop with this kind of stuff? It's just hard to do that. And again, you can just keep saying, I'm just going to throw money in and I will eventually get it to work. But there's just no guarantee. And it's just hard. I'm thinking about like indie developers who do like these massive updates to their game. And again, it's hard to say, does this make the game better? Or has the ship sailed? And I think that's another really good point. Again, there's that chicken or the egg situation that comes with these kinds of games. The games that are successful, were they successful because of the game was good? That the game was amazing out of the gates, it led to additional DLC, it led to all this stuff, and thereby, it made developers all this money, as what people think of the Darkest Dungeon. Or was the game successful because the developer understood all the aspects of managing the game? Handling the studio, budgeting, doing the PR, and making sure that they weren't stepping outside their comfort zone. And again, that's, I think, the point that with Darkest Dungeon, we've said this again. Darkest Dungeon didn't just succeed magically. It didn't just show up on PS4 and Xbox One and Switch, and lo and behold, it was a Game of the Year and Best Game. No, Red Hook Games worked their butts off to make sure that the pre-Kickstarter campaign worked, the Kickstarter campaign worked, Early Access did, post-release, and now cross-porting. But a lot of developers don't see that. And a lot of consumers don't see that as well. They only see the finished product. And the same thing goes for the AAA market. When you see people trying to copy PUBG or WoW or League of Legends, they just see the end result. And we've said this before, and I actually did I don't know if we did this live or I did a podcast or record one. Again, I did so many talks this past week where I said that there is a fundamental difference between I am going to copy your work, but I'm not going to really look at why you did it successful, versus I'm going to look at you, but then I'm going to say, how can I go in a different direction? And if you're just trying to copy these games, it just isn't going to work for you, because if you don't understand why they were successful, you're going to make a lesser quality game. And and that's another big point there about when you're trying to add up the price, nobody really wants to do that. Yep. And here's a really good point. We've said this before, but there are independent developers who just balk, and they are just vehemently opposed to any kind of PR work. Exactly. Like, they'll say, I don't need to do PR. My game is great enough. People are just going to find it. Why should I make a post on Twitter? Why should I have a forum? Why should I do any kind of marketing? My game is great enough as it is. Darkest Dungeon, they just did a great game. I can just do that. Stardew Valley, Five Nights at Freddy's. But the problem's, they're not understanding the work that went in. And if you're just trying to copy these games, people aren't going to play your game. Why should I play lesser PUBG when I can play PUBG? Why should I play a game that is just a little bit like Darkest Dungeon when I can play Darkest Dungeon? Especially when these games are continued to be supported. That's another big point. You released your game with a fraction of the content and support as well. And if I'm sitting here and I say, okay, here's your game, and it's got maybe 10, 15 hours of content, or here's World of Warcraft with over a decade of content, patches, and support, why should I play your game? Quality doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It takes time. It's why people still respect the craft of Nintendo and Blizzard. They know when you buy a Blizzard game or a Nintendo game, you are getting a quality product. And you're getting something that not a lot of people can copy. That Blizzard and Nintendo magic is real. That, je ne sais quoi, that makes those games appealing to a lot of people and the quality and polish that goes into them. You can't just play a Mario game and think, I'm just going to make a platformer with a plumber as a star, and I'm going to pull in Mario Odyssey numbers. Exactly. It takes work and time, and this is why we say that if you can't make a game that's going to be better than Mario or better than Overwatch, then don't make it. Go make something else. Make something that is different. And again, this is another phrase we keep saying, but the games that succeed, they're not just saying, I'm just making another Mario game, or I'm making another Dark Souls. They're saying, I'm making this, but I am doing X, Y, and Z differently. This is why Fortnite has worked and why it just didn't become buried under PUBG. Epic didn't say, let's just make PUBG with cartoon graphics. They did the crafting. And again, Fortnite was originally more of that, campaign tower defense gameplay. So there was a foundation there. But I'm willing to bet that a lot of the games that are going to fail to capture the Battle Royale market are just going to say, this is PUBG. Or maybe this is PUBG but in space. Or this is just PUBG but there are pirates wandering around. Or aliens. Or who knows what. Yep. And that's another really good point there, Getter. Be a king, don't come at a king. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying, that there is room to do different things. On our stream last night, where we were all playing, enjoying Alice Madness Returns, we were all kind of lamenting the disappearance of real-time strategy games, platformers, and brawlers. I mean, there's 3 good genres that you can do a lot of experimentation with and do something new, and you're not going to have to worry about Call of Duty, or Fortnite, or World of Warcraft, or Destiny, or even Warframe. You can do your own thing. But again, the industry is such a hit-driven market that once you see one thing become successful, everybody's trying to do the same thing. As another point, we saw this with the, slog of young adult translated, books to movies that happened over the last decade, from Harry Potter, Twilight, that Maze Runner, Percy Jackson, what was it? I can't even, there's so many of them I can't remember anymore. But now these days I just assume that if there's a movie coming out that is starring young adults or is about teenagers, that it's based on a young adult novel. And yep. And that's another point. Publishers will usually survive, but studios don't. The developers don't when these things don't work out for you. I mean, even games that are successful have gone under. I mean, again, I'm shocked that Disney Infinity has died. The same goes for Lego Dimensions. And that's another really big point. If the king dies, you don't want to get back on that throne. Because what's going to wait you there? I mean, even the amiibos aren't, that massive success as they were when they first came out. But Nintendo wasn't banking, a 3 to 4 year games as a service real-time development game strategy on the amiibos. It was just more or less like a secondary thing. And I'm going to bet you that's how the Labo is going to be as well. They're not going to be developing, 5 to 10 year games or banking on people having cardboard on their back. It's going to be another diversion. If it does well, they're going to support it. If it doesn't do well, it's just going to quietly die. But I'm going to bet you they're not going to put 100% effort into supporting the Labo. Not when they have the Switch, coming out of the gates being strong. But like going back to the point I just said, if the Toys to Life mark or if something just completely fails, you don't want to be trying to recapture that. Exactly, Garrett. And there's a really good point there. I actually mentioned the Virtual Boy in my presentation on Ready Player One and how it was one of the final nails in 90s VR. And again, and I'm sure Nintendo's also learned from the Wii and the Wii U as well, that you can't bank on something and if it's not being that successful, because guess what happens? And we saw this with what was it? Batman Arkham Origins. They were banking on that game selling well enough to get a year to 2 years of post-release story DLC, and they got one. And it goes back in with the amount of money and knowing when the game is done and when to keep supporting it. Saying, I'm going to release 10 hours of my game now, but I'm also going to budget for like 30 to 40 hours of post-release support and content in the next 2 to 3 years. What if no one likes that first 10 hours? What if you've already started working or started making, selling stuff for that additional content and nobody's there? You're kind of out of luck. And one other major point, again, it's good to plan for DLC, but you still need to support the game at the start. I need to know when I buy your game at 1.0 that this is a finished game. I am getting a complete meal. Going back to the food analogy earlier, plus I'm getting hungry. I need to go eat something when we're done here. But the point is, I don't want to walk into a restaurant and spend $50 and you give me one meal and then you tell me that, well, if enough people come in, I'll make you, your second course. People expect a finished product. And then the additional work in the DLC, that's icing on the cake. But you can't go into this saying, I'm going to do 50% of my game now, release it at 1.0, and then I'm going to use the additional sales and proceeds to finish the other half. Nobody wants that. And we've talked about this before with games on Early Access and Kickstarter, trying to bank on that additional money to somehow save this game or make the game that they originally intended. And I've said this before, and it's a very mean thing to say, but you have to know when enough is enough. And if you're trying to, maybe your idea is just too big to be made. If you can't make this 80-hour long magnum opus of a game with what you have, maybe don't make that game. Make it a 20-hour game. And I said this before when we were talking to Jake Burgett and Cliff Harris, but I think with a few other developers, but knowing what you want to make versus what you can make are two different things sometimes. And just because you're an independent developer and you have all the time in the world and you don't have a shareholder demanding your game's been released, that doesn't mean you can just throw caution to the wind. And the independent developers who are going to be around are going to be much like the AA and AAA studios. They're going to understand what the games they can make and budget those games accordingly. Yeah. Again, the game industry is such a rapidly moving industry that it's just hard for anything to come at a standard. And we've said there's been that growing move for unionizing for years now. And that's another really good point. If unions actually happen, what does that mean for the AAA market? What if a AAA studio can no longer go into crunch time? What if it becomes illegal for a studio to demand that employees work more than a 40-hour week? What's going to happen to a game budget then when games now have to take even longer, or they have to get paid maybe time and a half to work on those games? And I know that's got a lot of publishers sweating. But I know what you folks, the consumers who are watching this, are going to say. If an independent studio of 5 to 10 people can put out an amazing game, why should I care about EA losing money, or 2K, or Activision? Who here watching this is going to cry in their pillow tonight about EA possibly losing money? I don't think any of us are going to be doing that. Yep, and that's why the independent market has thrived with a lot of top talent going to it. Because they can avoid all that stress and all those problems. I mean, what would you rather do? Work at a studio demanding that you spend over 40 plus hours a week working on something that you may not even be interested in? Or work from the comfort of your own home making a game your dream game? I mean, it's very hard to say otherwise. But again, I think, let me check our time here. We gotta be closing in on an hour. Yes, we are. But again, just because you have that freedom doesn't mean you can neglect the business. It's kind of like one of those old like sitcom plots where the house or the overly structured place goes free and everybody can do whatever they want, and you think it's great, but without some semblance of order, complete chaos doesn't do anything either. And again, you have to have that balance between the artist and the businessman. And you have to be able to do both in order to succeed. Being rigidly tied to your chair to work on a game to the point of exhaustion doesn't help you make a great game. But also saying, you know what, I'm just going to work on this game for 30 minutes a week and it will get done, and I'm just going to relax, I don't care about it, that's not going to make a game either. As Mike has said a few times on the chat, ideas are one thing, implementation is another. We can all come up with ideas. I mean, hell, I could daze and amaze all of you with some of the game ideas that I've thought up over the years. Hell, maybe we could turn them into a video series at some point. But just because I can think of ideas doesn't mean I know how to implement them all the way. And when we spoke with Evan Todd about that with programming is not an easy thing to do. And one of the things that has made game design so popular the last few years has been the standardization of these tools and demystifying them. It's why a lot of people have turned to Unity or Game Maker, because being able to make that easy, why not? But at the same time, it means everybody can make a game. And when you have all that in the ether trying to get your attention, it's going to be hard to do it. I mean, it's why I'm attracted to playing Super Tower Deluxe right now, because I haven't seen a game like that in a long time. Yep. Hey, Marks, thanks for coming on. Yep, and that's true as well, Getter, that with the AAA market, it is high stakes. With an independent game, if you only spend 2 to 3 months working on it and it doesn't do well, okay, it hurts, but you didn't bet your whole house on it. If a AAA studio experiments and it fails, that could be 50 to 100 people out of a job. And even then, with independent space, we've talked about this before with the fast burn idea, that we have seen independent developers go all in, spending 2, 5, 10 years on a single game. And while that passion is there, I don't think those games made enough money to justify that. I mean, earlier in 2017, Jake Burgett, a industry veteran of 10 plus years of making games, was sweating bullets over whether or not Shadowhand was going to make enough money for them to keep going, or for them to have to keep doing this as a full-time job. And that's scary. When an industry vet is going all in on a game and they're nervous about it, what do you have to offer if you're, just right out of college, or, you and your 5 friends want to make a game for the next 4 years? Mm-hmm. And again, I think something has to give. Maybe the independent developers need more structure. Maybe the AAA space needs to, dial it down a little bit. But that actually raises another point. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the King. If a studio's, it's kind of like sharks sensing blood in the water. What if Activision, for the next Call of Duty, decides to cut the budget in half? Maybe they don't do, super high detail graphics. Maybe the multiplayer is not as great. And they, release it at $40, $30. Would that leave room open for EA or Activision to say, you know what? Call of Duty not doing so well? We're going to make our own $60 super big budget game and try to knock them out. Instead of it being a game of, it basically becomes Game of Thrones, with everybody trying to topple who's on top, and, the second they sense weakness. And it could work, or it could just, again, lead to everybody trying to make the same thing. I mean, we saw this with the action genre. After God of War came out, everybody tried to be the next God of War, but that's kind of fallen out. And let me check our time, because it is getting, we'll probably wrap things up in the next few minutes. We really need to have multiple topics tonight, because we just had one really good one. But when it comes to the big name games, I'm surprised we haven't seen more people try and copy, Bayonetta or The Legend of Zelda, because these are big successes. But the reason is pretty obvious. Games like Bayonetta, Breath of the Wild, Prey, Doom, they all have one very big thing in common. And while I comment on Getter's point, can any of you guess what do they all have in common, and why AAA studios aren't copying them right now? Yep, like with the major big box stores, again, I'm just going to one or the other. Like, why should I go to Target if I go to Walmart, or vice versa? Nope, that's not what I was thinking of, Getter, but let's see if anyone can guess it. Nope. What they all have in common is that they're single player. They have a fixed span in terms of growth and content. And one of the things that we've seen from the AAA market is that, as we said earlier, everybody is trying to go for multiplayer. They're trying to go for games as a service. They want that continued investment. Again, it raises a point. Should I develop a game at $60 that maybe will only have 10 to 20 hours of content, very little DLC, and that's it? Or should I release a $60 multiplayer game that I can continue to support with maps, additional modes, cosmetics, power curves, and so on, and get that additional money? No, I was talking about in terms of... Oh, yeah, actually, never mind, Draken, you're right there. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we've been seeing. The single player market has thrived with the independent space. I mean, pick an independent game from the last year that was amazing, or the last few years. Stardew Valley, Undertale, Five Nights at Freddy's. That could be arguably for some of us. I'm playing Super Daryl Deluxe right now. The console. Again, my mind is blanking because there's just so many examples. Asura from last year. These are single player experiences that are sold not at a $60 price. And again, I am very sure that no matter how much work and time Chucklefish, there we go, put into Stardew Valley over the 4 years of development, it probably didn't come close to the budget that Activision has for Call of Duty, or what Blizzard has for Overwatch. And again, it's one of those cases where developers are trying to put the cart before the horse. You can't sell me 3 years of content and support if your game is lacking in the first month. Console's interesting. I have a first look video up on the channel now, Draken. Oh, not Asura's Wrath. Asura. That's right, there's two games. Asura's Wrath is that was based on an anime or a manga, right? Asura that I'm talking about is the top-down Indian mythology-based roguelike, or action roguelike. Yeah. And that's a really good point there as well, Getter. There is a quality point as well. That, it takes a lot to make some of these games work. Like, no 5-man studio is going to make the next Bayonetta or the next World of Warcraft. We mentioned this about Kickstarters, but you cannot tell me that a 10-person team with $200,000, that's all they need to make a game that competes with World of Warcraft or Call of Duty. It's not going to happen. But there are ways of doing things differently. While you may not be able to make a fully 3D Bayonetta, maybe you can make a 2D inspired one. But again, it's about understanding what makes that work and what you can do within your budget. The Hellblade Senua Sacrifice game, them trying to make a AAA game but sell as a AA package, that could be another interesting market trend. We haven't really seen too many AA games in at least the last few years. I guess here's a question for you folks. What would you consider to be a AA game? I would say maybe like the Yakuza series, the games from Atlas. That could be pushing it. But are there any other examples? But it's very hard to do. It's very hard to convince people that maybe Call of Duty, the first-person shooter multiplayer genre, maybe that should only be done by the big boys. Because again, there's one thing developers hate, it's telling them what they can and can't do. That's a good point. Vermintide could be a AA game as well. And it's very hard, though, because we're seeing AA games pull off kind of like that AAA look and sheen. Because of the, what was that phrase? Democratization of, engines and stuff. You can have an independent developer make use of Unreal Engine and have a game look very close to a AAA studio. But if independent developers are trying to hit that AAA side, we're seeing AAA games being positioned or marketed next to independent games, and it gets very weird. Yep. But again, there's just that lack of transparency getter, that consumer doesn't know when they buy a game, how much work went into it. They can only assume that price equals quality, which I am sure for you folks just watching this right now, or my audience especially, you all just got like a pain in your chest by that. Because we know that just because you spend $50 on a game doesn't mean you're going to enjoy it 5 times as much as a $10 game. I mean, hell, I've said this before, I've gone over 100 hours out of The Binding of Isaac, and I spent $8 on that. And I probably have gotten less value from $50, $60 purchases. Yep. Nobody's telling you to spend $5 million on a game and have a Super Bowl advertising and full marketing campaign. That's a good point, Draken. How much was Life of Black Tiger? I don't know. Wow, I can't even spell tiger right now. I just misspelled that typing it quickly. But yeah, and it's going to be very telling again about what's going to happen with the Switch and their independent push. Because as I was just talking to an upcoming record podcast that I did, the Nintendo Switch being positioned as kind of like this green, beautiful pasture for independent games is going to be a very big deal. Because it solves Nintendo's problem. Well, we don't have enough, third-party games to, flesh out our offerings when we're making our first party. So let's bring innovative and amazing indie games to our platform, and that will fill it in. Because that's a very attractive selling point. You get amazing first party Nintendo games, and you get amazing independent games that you can play anywhere you want. Oh yeah, we've heard that before about, we have to sell the season pass. We need the DLC, or our game can't make it, or our studio's gonna close. But I think most consumers aren't buying it. When we see these games selling 2+ million copies at $60, it's very hard for us to, play the world's smallest violin and say, oh, boo-hoo, EA, you're not getting that money. Yeah. And again, like you see this even with people on YouTube. Like, I could be one of those people who every stream mention, I need the money to pay my bills. I need it. But again, people don't want to hear that. But with the game industry, yep, they had to sell it as, a special feature, I think, right? But, and this is one thing I know, Oscar, you've mentioned this on a few casts, but what happened to the days of just giving stuff away for free? What happened to the days of the retail purchase being enough, and then we see new maps and support as additional, as just, the thank yous to the fans? It's not that way anymore. It's now additional DLC. It's now consumers now expect these games to be supported for 6 months to a year. I mean, we mentioned this before with Battle Brothers. When Battle Brothers was over, the developers just said, I'm done. We're done. We don't want to do this anymore. It's a finished game. But people said, we want more. And, how dare you deny us that DLC? But again, the developer at the end of the day needs to know what their limits are. And sometimes you just have to say, this is it. For better or for worse, this is our game. We're not going to add 10 more things to this in the next 3 years. We're done. We want to go make something else. Into the Breach being a really good example, and FTL. Again, with Sunset Games. Sunset or Subset, I am really sorry if anyone is watching. Subset, there we go. That temptation is there. People were demanding and begging that they could do more DLC, and it could have worked. FTL, with getting almost 10 times the amount of money that they earned from the Kickstarter, they could have said, we're done with FTL, but we're going to make 5 more years of DLC. I mean, that huge jump between FTL to End of the Breach, or that huge time span, they could have been making who knows how many DLCs and additional content for that game. But they chose not to, and it was very smart of Subset. And again, developers like Red Hook Games and Subset, they didn't just make a successful game out of the ether. You can't just copy FTL or Darkest Dungeon and make that success without understanding how they succeeded and how they knew what they wanted to make and not to go beyond that. When I spoke with Chris Barassa from Darkest Dungeon, one of the original Kickstarter goals for that game was full animated cutscenes. And I mentioned this for those of you who watched my live play the live Let's Play of Darkest Dungeon with the Crimson Court. I would have loved more animated cutscenes of, going to that story. It sounds great. I mean, who among you watching me right now would have gotten a kick out of seeing more animated stuff from Darkest Dungeon? But when I spoke to Chris about on that post-mortem of Crimson Court, he said it was a nightmare to do all that. And they don't want to do that anymore. And that's fair. They could have, said, let's put all that more into the budget and do more animated work. But if it kills you in the process, or it's not making enough money to justify it, you have to know when to say no. King Me Gentleman saying, turning a simple Pong game into a 400-hour RPG with Smash Brothers, yeah. And don't forget loot boxes on top of that. Oh, Risk of Rain is getting a sequel. I think someone probably have said that. I must have forgotten that. But Oh my goodness. I just love it how it seems there's more conversation in the chat when Rob's not here, and it's getting me to just go on these game design talks longer than when I have a co-host to bounce off of. But my final point, unless anyone wants to bring something up, is as a game developer, yep, and that's another good point, Trek, and thank you for that. That, they could put all that on YouTube, so why would that really sell more copies? And that ties in this final point. As a game designer, one of the most important things you have to know is when to say no. And that's saying no to additional work on your end, no to the consumer. You have to know what you want to make and keep to it. Again, I spoke with Harebrained Schemes of Battletech, and the co-founder said that they routinely say no. Again, it would be easy to just say yes. Sure, let's add in more RPG elements. Let's add in, a PUBG Battle Royale mode and loot boxes. But at the end of the day, you have to know what kind of game you want to make, and you have to know when to stop. That's great. Well, like I said, if you guys want to, if you want me to do kind of like that little game design 20 questions thing, I post a link to it in chat at the top, and I'm taking questions for it from that thing. Yep. Yep, adding all that random stuff, it's hard. Oh my goodness, I'm getting on another topic right here, but when your game's in early access or it's not officially out yet, there's that feeling that I can just keep adding more stuff on. Who cares? The game's not done yet. But if that core game foundation, if your core gameplay loop isn't bringing people in, it doesn't matter if you have, random clothing or I remember when I spoke with Bill Gardner, that light setup he had, which I would love to get here, of the different color lights, it's not going to do anything. It's like having Getter, you're making me hungry too. It's like having a well done, beautiful steak and then throwing all these random sides and stuff on top of it that it just ruins the meal. This is why Oscar and I'm sure you folks as well, are very excited about Dead Cells. Dead Cells has been in early access for the better part, I think, of a year now, and they've added in more content. But here's the point. When we played Dead Cells, early access version 1, it was great. That core gameplay loop was amazing, and it could only get better from there. And that's the big point. You don't want to wait until halfway to 3/4 done your development to say, what's our core gameplay going to be like? And if you have that hook from the get-go, it's going to lead to a stronger game and a stronger development over the course of its process. It's why we say iteration and play testing are so important. You need to figure out what works and what doesn't from as early as possible. You don't want to wait 2 years down the line and you are completely isolated in your cave/home to then show people your game and they all say, yeah, this, what you just showed me, I hate it. Why don't you go make something else? And unfortunately, it means, putting yourself out there. And it's that catch-20, that's another catch-22 of the game industry. If I show my game early, it means I get more eyes on it. But then what if people don't like that version? What if, that magic 10 to 20% at the end is when my game comes together? But I hate to say it, I'm curious what you folks think. I don't think that's true anymore. That, your game is 80% and it's not good, and then those last 20% makes it a great game. I think, again, it's that iterative process. That you should be getting into a point where people are liking it, and it should only get better from there. Yes, that last 10 to 20% of polish can make your game pop, but there has to be a foundation to begin with. This omelet is trapped in some kind of shells. And who put all this extra salt on it as well? We're turning this into a cooking show, folks, and I didn't even realize it. But, like I said, yeah, and that's a good point there, King Me, that I'm the same way. I'm not going to suffer through 20 hours of your game and then get to the good stuff. Ah, Draken, that's the old example. You're lucky, Oscar. I need to have like a little what was it, a hot grill right next to me, and I can just make lunch and dinner while I'm talking. There's that there's that myth that if I show my game early to someone, they're going to steal it. I don't think that's true. And when I spoke with when we did that whole cast with Tim Ruswick, we mentioned that everybody has ideas, but it's the implementation or the devil's in the details that will make it work or not. Again, everyone can say, I'm going to make a medieval roguelike with Lovecraftian elements to it. But how many of those people are going to get to the level of Darkest Dungeon polish and design? And I'm sure, I think I've even saw this on mobile, that there's people trying to copy Darkest Dungeon or do stuff like that. Yeah. The good stuff of the game is the last 20. Yeah, why should you suffer through 8% of crap to get to that, that little, like, chocolate center in the middle? Yeah, the mobile clones is a very interesting point. And it goes back to what we said with the MMOs. If you're trying to chase the king, and not the king as in, well, actually, you could be chasing the king of the king developer. There is one called that. But if you're chasing the king, why should people go for you? Make your first level last. Or the first level should be the final level that you design, or the final one that you finish. Because you want your game to be good out of the box. You don't want people to say, your game was amazing, but the first 3 hours was crap. This is why Oscar and I, we were talking about in Celebration of Violence, and how it feels like the first 4 to 10 hours of that game is you just getting your ass kicked until you get the persistence systems up to that point where you can stand competitively against everybody else. I don't want to play a game where I'm -5 when I start out with, and I have to work my way up. Let me start at where I can actually start playing your game. It goes back to what we were saying earlier about content. 60 hours of game doesn't magically make your game 6 times better than a 10-hour game. And I think people are a lot more time conscious today than they were maybe 10, 15 years ago, when there's so many games being released. Some call it a genre. Again, look at me. I have like I got 3 more press keys this week, and I've only checked out 1. I don't want to spend 200 hours playing your game to get to that last 50 hours of greatness. Yeah, and then Breath of the Wild just said, we don't give you a tutorial anymore, we're just going to throw you in. But it's better, I think, today to have a 30-hour amazing game versus a 60-hour game of being just average. And I think people are getting a little bit more aware of that, especially with the value we're getting from independent games. I mean, we're seeing amazing games at the $5 to $20 price mark. And I think it comes back to this. If I'm going to play your game for 80 hours, it's because I love it so much. Not because you force 50 hours of boss rushes and repeating levels over and over again. But I'd rather spend my time playing, 5 hours of amazing stuff rather than just, 15 hours of being bored half the time. And if you can cut out that, fad or that dead time, it's just going to make your game better, because nobody wants to do that to begin with. But my goodness, yeah, we're almost an hour and a half in, and my voice is dying, and all this talk about food is making me very hungry. Yep, just bloated out. And I better stop reading chat or I'll get on another 20-minute topic here. But we're going to wrap things up for this week's Game Wisdom Live. So thank you so much for watching this live or recorded. For you folks who came in late, here's the link to the video regarding the game design Q&A session. And like I said, let me know what you think about opening up the Discord to making it for everybody and keeping like the reward tiers kind of for the other stuff. But I will say this, if we do make the Discord channel open, the VIP videos, that's the ad-free versions of these talks and making them early, those will still be for the $5 tier, because I still need to make that, attractive for people. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Tomorrow I'll be posting, for those of you watching this live, will be the Dissecting Design of Age of Empires 2. Tonight we'll be going back to Dark Souls 2, see if we can wrap that up. But otherwise, check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I'm going to go get something to eat now, so I will see you all later, and hopefully I'll be well fed and my thirst will be handled for our next stream. So until then, have a great rest of the Sunday afternoon.